as something good in itself as well as a means to another end. And that's the purely double distilled essence of it that one saw on September the 11th, but I still prefer to call that religious fascism because that's what it really is.
Let me say this notion of exploitation.
And as for the Israelis, everybody knows that, because I mustn't seem to duck that question because I know how toxic it is, everybody knows that if you want to occupy people against their will, if you want to be the governor of another people who haven't chosen you, you will end up visiting terrible cruelty on them. There certainly cannot be a humane occupation.
Andrew Sullivan?
I would say, quite simply, this concept of exploitation, the idea that America, by being a beacon for many other people around the world, is somehow exploiting other countries, is baloney. The reason people come here is because it's freer here. If those countries in the Middle East don't want to be exploited, get yourselves democracy. Get yourselves a free market. Why are we making excuses for countries that do not do the obvious thing to create wealth and power and security and freedom for their citizens? It is not America's responsibility to do that. I'd also say that the context in which Christopher's been talking about, many of America's foreign engagements, and some of which I agree with him, have not been pretty, was the context of a global struggle against tyranny called the Soviet Union, in which many things were done which, in an ideal world, one would have regretted, and one does regret. However, the alternative, which was caving in to those thugs in Moscow, was much worse. I'd also say that no country in the history of the world has had this much disproportionate power and wielded it so gently.
Well,
there's no actual occupation of places against their will by the United States in any meaningful sense compared to the British or the Germans or any other previous empire.
I don't actually know when it was that the Cuban people signed off on having the Guantanamo base on this. So to give you a small example,
to compare
but it is certainly true. It is
with the
certainly
British
true,
Empire or Nazi occupation.
It's certainly true that the American occupation of Cuba and of many other territories in Central and South America well predates the Bolshevik Revolution even. So your critique is ahistorical as well as politically, I think, rather opportunist.
Bradenton, Florida, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. Likewise to you, Brian, and C-SPAN. 3 quick things, if I could. First, I believe that when the president uses general terms like good and evil to describe our conflicts, he kind of crosses the line between separation of church and state. Secondly, Brian, you asked a week or so ago people about campaign finance reform, and I think it's not as important what people give to the congressman, but more what they give back, retroactive tax breaks. Thirdly, though, my influences are people like Alan Watts and Joseph Campbell, and there's an old Chinese proverb that virtue that strives to be virtue is not virtue. Virtue that's not aware of itself is true virtue.
Thanks. Let me ask you some things. There's a big newspaper article on both of you in the New York Observer a couple of weeks ago. The two of you are competing to become the George Orwell of America. Yes. Did you buy off on that?
An acutely embarrassing article, I thought.
Embarrassing because
it was meant to be flattering, and it was extremely complimentary.
By Ron Rosenbaum?
By Mr. Rosenbaum, who, well, he opened with a question, which was why were 2 English writers, in his view, producing the best stuff on the consequences of September 11th. That's a compliment one could perhaps accept. I mean, I think it would be rather extreme. But to be compared with George Orwell, whose entire life was a sacrifice and a battle and a risk. And so
he was a socialist.
And certainly was. And he's my gold standard for a leftist writer. But that's exactly why I find the mention embarrassing. I mean, I have never had to take chances or risks or sacrifices in the sense.
What did you think of the article?
I agree with Christopher. It was immensely flattering, but Orwell to me was the person I read when I was 12, 13, 14. He is such an icon for me in terms of less his actual substantive politics, which I respect, although disagreed with in some respects, than the honesty and decency of his writing, the sheer clarity of his prose, which is a model for anybody, and the idea that I could be equated with him was immensely flattering, but also, I think, way too flattering.
Let me ask you a number of questions.
I winced even more at Andrew being compared with him, but I mean, I winced when I was.
Yeah, I understand that. If you had to choose a country to live in besides Great Britain and the United States?
India.
India?
Yeah,
you would love there.
I love India. I've often felt, it's the only place I've ever felt so instantly at home. I mean, it must seem incongruous when you look at me, but I just,
Andrew?
I love India.
Sullivan?
I would die. I wouldn't live
You would
anywhere
not pick
else.
anywhere else.
No.
Delton, Michigan, you're on the air.
Thank you, Brian. Thank God for C-SPAN. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
I was wondering if we could take a different tack on the vice president being sued by the GAO. And was wondering, the other day on Wednesday, one of your guests was asked the question whether a French book that had come out recently, it was the Bin Laden, The Forbidden Truth, that was asking the question whether we had dealings with the Taliban over oil or importation to that country. And he blew it off as that was old news, and he didn't want to talk about it. But I was just wondering, could that be the gist of some of the information that is wanting to be looked at? Thank you.
I don't know, and I don't know about the story that you mentioned. I've heard of it, but I imagine that other people would pursue it if it had real salience. Look, I think, however, that the government should be forthright with who comes into the White House and so on. I do not believe, however, that every government conversation, every detail of every conversation should be divulged to the public. I don't believe in completely transparent government. It's different than open government. Government should be open to inquiry, but transparency would mean there are certain sphere of freewheeling ideas and thought and opinions that I think our leaders need in a safe environment to be able to talk over things and to think the unthinkable and to say things that if it came out would be politically embarrassing. And I think that kind of freedom for effective government is important, and I'm nervous that if the GAO wins, there'll be no ability for government to have serious confidential discussions in future.
You see, that really shows that you do have the soul of a Tory in a funny way.
I do.
You think these people have a sort of natural right to rule?
No.
Well,
I just think that there is a clearly you cannot govern effectively unless you can talk freely amongst yourselves
as you must,
at some point.
But you know very well, you've just been praising the fact that Mr. Bush, as long as he can control the way it's done, can make us aware of his private diary, as long as it can be given to the Washington Post so that they have control over the image presented, whereas what Congressman Waxman is asking, and the GAO is asking, is not for the conversations between the Vice President and his staff or anything like that. They want to know what the input was from people who've since benefited, the people who made campaign donations, and whether they were protected or not. That's a very legitimate question. It's more in the nature of a police inquiry.
Can I ask you a question about the diary? Apparently, and I say apparently, I didn't see it, I read it, that the Bush White House let one of these reporters, Dan Bowles or Bob Woodward, look at his diary around the time of September the 11th. What then happens if someone someday says, we want to subpoena the diary, and they say executive privilege?
Well,
what's the difference?
Look, the difference is very simple. The difference, this is about privacy, and it's a very important matter. It's being destroyed in our culture. The ability to have any private communications is being destroyed among private citizens as well among public officials.
So the president will be allowed to show it when he wants to, but then
yes,
not show it when he doesn't
absolutely.
want to.
It is his prerogative whether his own private matter should be, genuinely private matters should be dispersed to the public. Without that, we'd have a camera in his bedroom. The guy has to have some kind of zone.
No one would turn on. No one would watch it.
How can you govern a country when everything you say in private can be...
The White House, maybe where he lives, it is not his home, it is not his house, it belongs to the people. It was Mr. Clinton's idea, and particularly Mrs. Clinton's idea, to seek a privacy defense precisely by saying, this is our place, not yours.
I don't agree with that.
You can't allow
I agree with you on that one, Christopher. Clearly. However, you've got to have some sphere in which you can talk freely with people in an unofficial capacity to get advice and thoughts. I think you should divulge exactly who they are, all their contacts, when they came, when they left. But I think you should be able to have some privacy within that.
So you think the Vice President ought to give these names and dates and times?
I think names, dates, times, but not necessarily content, because I think they should be free to do so if they want to, but I think it could violate the possibility of governing at all.
West Seneca, New York, on the Republican line. Good morning.
Good